So today, the title of the talk is Measuring Opportunities of Women in Peacekeeping Operations, Gender Norms and Institutional Barriers to Women's Equal Participation. Sabrina is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University, and her research focuses on conflict and peace processes, particularly state building in the aftermath of civil war. Sabrina has a really impressive track record in this area already. She's working on a book actually, I think you've finished that, haven't you, Sabrina? When Peace Makes States, is that correct?
It's not finished, it's in progress still.
Okay, sorry, yes. You published though, I'm just keeping track of you. And you also co-authored Equal Opportunity Peacekeeping, which is a brilliant book with Oxford University Press, Women, Peace and Security in Post-Conflict Countries. And that was the winner of Conflict Research Studies Best Book Prize in 2017. And the American Political Science Association Conflict Processes Best Book Award for 2018. Sabrina does really interesting research and methods, including field experiments, lab experiments, and surveys, and most of her research is located in sub-Saharan Africa. Work has appeared in, I suppose what we would call phenomenally impressive journals like the American Political Science Review, International Organization. She's just received a grant from the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, which is looks like a fascinating 8-country assessment of women's barriers and opportunities to join police, military, and UN peacekeeping missions. It's a real privilege and honor to have you speaking with us today, Sabrina. So the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. There's a lot of great people that have been a part of that process and have been working with me along the way. So, but thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this wonderful series. It's humbling to be in the series with such great other people that have given talks. So I haven't done this yet, so this is my first shot at giving a talk from a computer screen from afar, so I will give it my best shot, but let's see what happens. And that kind of also speaks to the kind of talk that I want to give today, which is a little bit of an overview of where we are in the Women, Peace and Security research agenda, with a particular focus on what I've done in the past. So a little bit thinking about equal opportunity peacekeeping, my first book, but then really focusing on this big project that I have going on with DCAF at the moment, which is called Measuring Opportunities for Women in Peacekeeping Operations. And it's an extension of the first book on women in peacekeeping. And it's very exciting in terms of the amount of work that's going into it, but also how it's affecting policy going forward at the UN in terms of peacekeeping. So we're in the middle of it, so I welcome any thoughts and comments or questions about the process, about some of the findings. I don't have too many findings to offer you today, but just kind of some preliminary findings on a couple of countries. But that's where we are. So it's a little bit more of an overview talk than it is a particular paper or anything like that. So to give you an outline of the presentation, I'll just speak briefly about UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which is the first resolution in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and then honing in on what it means for women to participate in peacekeeping operations. This new initiative by the Canadian government, starting in 2017, to move the agenda forward at the UN on women in peacekeeping. And that has led to this Measuring Opportunities for Women in Peacekeeping project. And then I just have a few thoughts and comments about the future of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, because we are in 2020, which is the 20th anniversary of the resolution. So, I think this year there were a lot of things that were planned around the 20th anniversary. A lot of those things have been canceled or postponed. So I think this is at least an opportunity to be able to speak a little bit about where I think the agenda should go, moving on from here. So let me set the context a little bit first with kind of the background of where 1325 emerged. It emerged in the 1990s with an enormous effort, informally and formally, with women's organizations lobbying the UN to make this point that with these the increasing numbers of civil wars in the world, so we can see this graph right here, particularly in between the 1980s, 1990s, that women experience war differently than men. It's a very gendered experience, and what I have here is a graph of this difference. And what we see is that men are more likely to die as a result of war. And so that means that women are more often survivors. And we often kind of think of women and children as those that are the most vulnerable in conflicts, when actually, it's the men that are dying. And that's one of the points that Charlie Carpenter and others have made, that, when it comes to riskiness, war is actually much more risky than men, but we tend to essentialize women as being vulnerable. But that's not to say that these experiences are different. And so that's kind of the heart of where this resolution started, is recognizing that these experiences are indeed different and lobbying for more attention to women's needs as a result of conflict. And so we, as a culmination of this kind of organizing and advocacy, we saw the passing of UN Resolution, Security Council Resolution 1325 in the year 2000, and it centered around 4 pillars. So participation, women's participation in the policymaking world related to conflict. So that means in negotiations and mediation processes, in peacekeeping, and in the aftermath. The second pillar is on protection. So this is the protection of women during war and in the aftermath of war. So in terms of civilian victimization. And this was really a response to some of the major wars of the 1990s, like in Rwanda and in Bosnia, that saw very high levels of sexual violence, for example. The third pillar and the fourth pillar are often forgotten in this agenda, and maybe misinterpreted a little bit. So prevention is really about the prevention of conflict in general. It's in the prevention of violence. And relief and recovery is usually geared towards thinking about refugees and humanitarian response. So thinking about these 4 pillars, in the 20th anniversary year, which is this year, where are we? Well, we have not just 1325 that was passed in 2000, but we have these other I think there's 10 resolutions now that are related to women, peace, and security. And what they mainly focus on are these first 2 pillars. So if we go back, they focus on the participation pillar and the protection pillar, with a lot of emphasis on preventing sexual violence, wartime sexual violence, and a lot of focus on improving women's participation in peacemaking and in particular peacekeeping. We've also seen that 1325 has been implemented in regional organizations, so in NATO, and then also in the African Union. So it is really kind of a standardized and institutionalized agenda in the international community. And also at the state level. So this is a graph or figure of all of the countries that have passed a national action plan for 1325. So what does that mean? That means that the country government in all of these countries have come up with a plan for implementing 1325 and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in their own countries. And what some interesting work that has been done on these national action plans shows, is that many of these action plans are outward focused, which means that the foreign policy of a country deals with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So you can imagine that maybe the European countries, the US, for example, it's the State Department or the foreign ministries that have incorporated the Women, Peace, and Security, so it's a part of their foreign policy, as opposed to some countries which have adopted a more domestic-oriented plan where they're actually changing their own institutions and their own governments. So that's the main difference in what you see in terms of variation in the national action plans, inward focusing versus outward focused. So I'm happy to answer some questions about that as well. Okay, so if we're now focusing on this first, the first pillar, women's participation, there's been a whole host of literature on women's participation in politics, women's participation in peace negotiations, in mediation, in peacekeeping and peace building. And where my research has focused is on women's participation in peacekeeping, and not just thinking about how to increase the numbers of women, which I'll get to, but also what is a gendered peacekeeping operation look like? How does gender affect peacekeeping, kind of in a more holistic way? And so this was the focus of my first book, where what Kyle and I were trying to do was trying to understand, okay, let's just look at the numbers first of all, and see just what the numbers are in terms of the number and also proportion of women who are deployed to peacekeeping operations. And unsurprisingly, there were low levels of participation when we started this project back in 2012, and they've since increased, which I'll show you in a minute. But it's not just that there were low levels of participation, but we also noticed that there was variation. So it's not that it was a standard 2% in the military and 5% in the police, but we saw variation from 0 to 5% in the military, and from 0 to up to 15%, and it's higher now, in the police force in terms of contributions. And so we wanted to explore this variation, and in terms of trying to understand why some countries send more women and where they send the women. And one of the core findings is that women are deployed to safer missions, so missions where there's less peacekeeper death, that see less armed conflict. Places like Cyprus, which is considered sometimes a vacation deployment. Those are the places where women tended to deploy. And I think some subsequent work that has recently come out in the last few months actually corroborates this finding, which is great. Also, well, not great in terms of trying to make changes, but at least there seems to be some consistency. We also found that this is not a numbers game. So it's not that if you have higher numbers of police women in your national police force or women in your national military, that you are sending more peacekeepers or more female peacekeepers. There didn't seem to be much of a correlation between how many women you have at home versus how many women you're sending. So there's something else going on. And in addition to women's participation, we were also interested in sexual exploitation and abuse and trying to understand variation in why certain countries or some missions were seeing higher levels versus lower levels of sexual exploitation and abuse. And there, the key kind of findings from the book and some papers were that countries that were performing better on gender equality, when those countries were incorporated into peacekeeping missions, there were lower levels of sexual exploitation and abuse. And I will say that there's been some work since we have published this book that goes more in depth into the SCA work, and there's better data now as well. Okay, so that brings us to kind of the present day in terms of moving this agenda forward. And the Canadians decided in 2017 that they wanted to be the pioneers in moving this women, peace, and security agenda as it relates to women in peacekeeping forward. And so they launched a 5-year project called the ELSI Initiative as a way for the Canadian government to get back into a leadership position in the peacekeeping world, which they were before Rwanda. And so this is a kind of maybe a benign way for them to take a leadership role in the UN on this issue. And they have put in a lot of money into trying to increase the numbers of women in peacekeeping missions. They started something called the ELSI Trust Fund, which basically is a trust fund with a pot of money for any country that wants help in how to increase their proportions and numbers of women. And so they can apply for a grant or apply for funds to then use to try to improve their numbers when it comes to women in peacekeeping. And the work that I've been doing over the last year or so is related to how this money in the trust fund is going to be dispersed. Okay, so what do the numbers look like more recently? So I didn't mention this, but you can see this now, that the target for the UN for 2020 was 20% women in police and 15% in the military. And so if you look, so the blue line here represents the police, in terms of UN police contribution. So actually, we're here. UN target. Sorry, percentage of women in policing roles. And then the green is staff officers, and the gray are experts or observers. And then we have troop contingents in the darker gray. And one thing that you might start to realize when you're looking at this is, wow, what happened in 2017 and 2018? We kind of see a pretty big jump. And there's two different explanations. So the first explanation is that maybe we really do see higher numbers. So countries have just gotten better at sending higher proportions of women into peacekeeping missions, a higher number of women into peacekeeping operations. But there's actually also a second explanation, and that is what I want to propose here, which is that around the same time, so if we're thinking of this 2015, 16, 17, 18 time period, we've also seen a decrease in the total number of peacekeepers who are deploying because there have been a number of prominent missions that have decreased or that have withdrawn. So the UN mission in Liberia, then the UN mission in Haiti were in withdrawal phases starting in 2015 and have, as of at the end of 2017, completely withdrawn in Liberia, and as of this year, completely withdrawn in Haiti. And so basically another alternative for why we see higher proportions is potentially because the denominator has actually gotten smaller. And so it's easier to increase the proportion of women if you have a lower number at the bottom or in terms of total contributions. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to unpack the degree to which that is the case. And I have kind of made the argument that this is what, because of the withdrawal in numbers, this is potentially why we're seeing a higher proportion. And so there's still work to be done. Okay, so which countries are actually doing well? Normally when I do this presentation, it's very interactive, and we do a guessing game at this point, so I can't really do that with you. So I'm just going to give you the answers, which is number 1 is South Africa, followed by Ghana and Zambia. And these are just kind of a list of the top contributing countries. I don't know how much all of you know about peacekeeping, but something to maybe note from this, and you can observe this from looking at the countries that are top contributors, is that they do tend to be non-Western countries that are deploying higher numbers, and countries that are tend to be from Africa or South Asia. And the reason for this is because these are countries that make a profit from sending peacekeepers. So the UN sends these countries a certain amount per head, per capita, per soldier, per police officer. And in countries where that the cost of the salary of that particular individual is lower than what they are getting per head, these countries are actually making a profit. And so that's why you see, in Ethiopia, Bangladesh, India, Nepal as top contributors, because the country is actually making money off of sending peacekeepers. And here you can see in gray the proportion that they are sending. And I should note there's no premium on sending women, so there's no extra financial gain by sending more women, but this is one of the potential policy solutions that the UN is currently looking at to try to increase the proportion and numbers. And I'm happy to, in the Q&A, talk about whether I think that's a good idea or not. The short answer is I don't think that's a good idea. Okay. All right, so this is the next step in this, I guess, is then going back to the trust fund to which countries can apply for to then distribute funds to increase the proportion or the number of women in their countries. And what the Canadian government wanted to do was to not just disperse money randomly without kind of understanding where the money was going to go and how it was actually, whether or not it was actually going to improve the situation, but rather a systematic way to evaluate what the major barriers to women's participation really are, so that those funds could be targeted to where the barriers are specifically. And because there's a lot of assumptions about what the barriers are, but no systematic study about what the barriers specifically are, and to what degree each barrier affects different countries, because every country is different. And so that is basically what my team has been tasked to do, is to come up with a set of barriers and to measure them in different countries. And so what I want to do right now is to share these 10 barriers that we have developed over the course of about a year and a half. And we have tested these in 4 countries, and revised the barriers a little bit based off of what we found. But also, I will share the methodology that we're using to measure each of these barriers, which we are also in the stages of finalizing, but also editing and tweaking. Okay, so barrier number 1 is the eligible pool. And this is what I was saying is kind of the main assumption for why we see lower numbers. This is basically if you do have an eligible pool of women in your national police force, in your military to send. So some countries just don't have women in their security forces. Some countries have a lot of women in their security forces. So that's a potential barrier. And I should mention here that it's not just about numbers, but where women are. So do you have enough women in tactical units, for example, to send as formed police units? Or do you have enough women in battalions in the military to send as battalions, right? Are they eligible for combat? Are they in combat roles? Enough women in combat roles, I should say. So that's the first barrier. The second barrier is about selection. So the country, government, or police force, or military, or some combination chooses the people that go to the mission. And this is particularly so for UN police officers and for military observers. There is an application process in many countries and a very rigorous selection process. And that's also very much true sometimes for formed police units. Not all countries have the same process for selecting formed police units or forming formed police units, and even battalions. And so the selection process could be a potential barrier, especially, as you can imagine, if there's corruption or discrimination against women at that stage. The deployment criteria is the third barrier, and this has to do with what are the UN's criteria and what are the country's criteria for eligibility to be able to deploy. And what's interesting here is first that there's interestingly not a standardized criteria that all countries adopt. So to give you some example, so in some countries you have to have a certain rank or a certain number of years in the military or in the police force. You have to have passed a test in English or in French or in have particular sets of computer skills. In most cases, you have to be able to shoot a weapon. You have, in some countries, a physical fitness test, not in others. And so these criteria are also very gendered. So you can imagine that men might perform better depending on the historical access to education that women might have or training in a particular country. But the other really interesting thing is that these criteria are all gendered male, usually. So if we think about shooting, driving, computer skills, those are things that men might perform better at, and they're kind of gendered male. Whereas a lot of the things that are necessary for a mission success at the tactical level or on the ground are actually kind of feminine qualities. And one of the most interesting findings from the study has been when we ask peacekeepers, what is the most important skill that you need on the ground to be successful? They say communication skills, conflict resolution skills, and negotiation skills. But those skills, conflict resolution, communication, listening, etc., those are not criteria to deploy to a peacekeeping mission. But you could imagine that if they were criteria, that perhaps it would equalize this kind of gendered field of criteria where women might have a better shot in some cases of actually meeting the criteria. Okay, number 4 is household constraints. So this is what kind of barriers do women face at home and also in their community? So are they allowed to deploy? Do their husbands allow them to deploy? Do they have children at home? What are the caretaking options in the military, in the police force, or at home? Paternal leave, maternal leave, etc. So that's And this again is another one that most people assume is a major barrier for some countries, or for all countries, and that actually we have found has not been the case. Number 5 is about the infrastructure that is required for peacekeeping. So things like, does the country have gendered, so male and female barracks? Do they have bathrooms for women and men in the mission, in their barracks, do they have uniforms and equipment? Do they have access to healthcare? All of these things that, men and women need, but that might be specific to men and women as well. So that's another barrier. Negative experiences is number 6. So this is the idea that if women have a negative experience in the mission, or if men do, this could be, maybe they face discrimination or harassment on the mission, or, something happens to them. It's maybe they get robbed, or something happens on the mission. They're likely to come back and tell their network. And so that might discourage other women from deploying, and it might discourage them from redeploying. And so negative experiences, or the experience in the mission, really matters. Career value is probably the least gendered of these barriers, in the sense that peacekeeping missions might not be helpful for somebody's career. And it really depends on the country. So in the US, for example, peacekeeping missions do not help you climb rank, and they are not something that's esteemed. But rather, if you go on a peacekeeping mission, it's seen as like a demotion or a holiday. But that's the opposite in a country like Bangladesh, where it's very prestigious and it can help you in your career. So we want to measure the degree to which peacekeeping is valued. Top-down leadership has to do with whether or not the leadership in your country, in the military and in the police, value gender or understand gender, and how much they're willing to champion the idea of promoting women in peacekeeping operations. Finally, the last 2, gender roles and social exclusion, are cultural barriers. And these are hard to measure and hard to change. So gender roles has to do with measuring the degree to which there are gender stereotypes in the host country's military or host country's police force. And social exclusion is the secret way of saying patriarchy. So what we're actually trying to measure here are patriarchal norms within the military and the police force, and you'll kind of get a sense of that, of what that looks like. So these are the 10 barriers. I welcome questions around them and comments. And so how are we measuring these things? So we have a 3-prong approach, so 3 tools. We've developed a fact-finding form, which is basically an institutional questionnaire with 200+ questions about facts about the institution. So this is filled out by a country team, mixed between researchers and personnel from the military or personnel from the police, that just answer questions about things like, do you have a sexual harassment policy? How many, what are the numbers for deployment? There's a whole host of questions, as you can see. We also are doing key decision maker interviews, 20 to 30, to get a sense of how decisions about peacekeeping are made at the highest level. So things like who is deciding whether or not the country is going to prioritize sending military peacekeepers versus police, or are they going to send contingents versus military observers? So those things all impact the degree to which women can deploy. And then finally, we have a representative survey, which is not actually representative because we're oversampling women at 50%, of 380 people in the military or police. And we're trying to, as much as possible, create a random sample across geography, rank, and unit to try to make it as representative as possible. And what's really great about this survey is that it's one of the first, at least I think the first to my knowledge, where we're actually getting to survey people that have not deployed. So we're getting a full sense of the eligible pool, or the pool of people from which peacekeepers can deploy. And so eventually we'll have a sample of 3,040 soldiers and police officers, maybe more, across 8 countries, to kind of learn about who peacekeepers are and how they're chosen, and who are not, who are the people that don't deploy, right, as well. So here are the 8 countries: Zambia, Ghana, Uruguay, Jordan, Senegal, Mongolia, Bangladesh, and Norway. We have conducted surveys, thankfully, finished in 4 countries before the world fell apart, in Zambia, Ghana, Senegal, and Uruguay. So I will be able to only share some findings with you from Zambia because part of the process is that we present our findings to the country first before making anything public. And so we've completed the entire process with the Zambia National Police Service. So that report is more or less public now, but that's not the case with Ghana, for example. So I can't really disclose too much. I've never been in a position where I have classified information, but I guess this is classified. But I'm happy to kind of talk about some general findings. Okay. So what have we learned so far? This is what I mean by general findings. So it is definitely true that different countries have different barriers. So Zambia faces a big problem with selection. They also face a problem with the criteria for deployment, which is heavily gendered, and there seems to be not a lot of understanding about criteria. And the women there face household constraints. Now, this is quite different from what women in the Ghanaian armed forces face. They only share one of the main, so we are kind of ranking all of the barriers in each of these countries. I should have mentioned that. So these are kind of the top 3 in Zambia. And Ghana only shares one of the barriers of Zambia's top 3, and they have 2 other barriers that are more acute, that weren't so acute for Zambia, for example. So just to show you a little bit of the data, I guess. So this is barrier 2. Zambian policewomen are less likely to have information about deployments to peacekeeping. Our survey it's a long survey. It's about an hour and a half. It has over 120 questions. So there's a lot of questions, but I just wanted to just show you kind of an example. And then something else that we're doing is creating scales for the last 2 barriers. So I mentioned barrier 9 and barrier 10 are cultural barriers. And so we've been thinking theoretically about how to measure gender stereotypes and about how to measure toxic masculinity. And these are the questions that are related to that. I might just leave this up here for a second for you to take a look. Just not say anything for a second. And so what we've done is created a scale using these questions. And one of the more interesting findings in Zambia was that peacekeeping missions might have a socializing effect on this particular scale. So those that were deployed actually scored better in terms of having less ideals about militarized masculinity or toxic masculinity. And those who had never deployed tended to hold more toxic masculine views. And so this is unexpected. It's not something that we had hypothesized before, but it's something to definitely explore in the other countries. And so why is it that peacekeeping missions might have a positive socializing effect potentially on patriarchal or toxic masculine views about things, right? So these are just 2 kind of examples of the data. And then with the remaining time that I have left, I just wanted to talk a little bit about moving forward and what the agenda for women, peace, and security could be, and some things to consider. And this part is unfortunately very participatory. So I'm just going to try to do it that way, and you can just do it kind of, I guess, individually. But one of the things that I think should happen in the next, iteration of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is a shift from women to gender. And so the way that I like to talk about this is to put up this riddle. And I usually, when I teach gender, this is kind of what I start out with in one of the first classes. Is I put this up on the board or on the screen and ask people, who is the surgeon? And some of you, I'm sure, have seen this beforehand and know the answer, so you can think about it. And I'll just leave it here for a second so you can think of the answer. Okay, so the answer is the mother. The surgeon is the mother, and so maybe hopefully all of you got that. But what actually tends to happen in my classes is that not everybody thinks of the mother. In fact, I think in one of my classes one year that I taught it, the one person I think had volunteered and shared that he had thought that it was the gay father, right? And so the idea behind this riddle is that we have these assumptions in our head that are really difficult to get rid of. They're ideas that have been ingrained in our head about gender and gender roles for a really long time. And so how do we get rid of these implicit biases? So implicit bias tests, for example, I think for peacekeeping missions as a criteria would be a really great thing to do, especially for leadership positions. This is another puzzle that I like to put up. So in one instance, in the military operation in Iraq, so this is the US military, many female US soldiers became dehydrated and 2 died as a result. And so what I usually do is I have people brainstorm in groups, why do you think this happened? And a lot of people think, oh, maybe it's because the women didn't drink enough water, or it's the desert, and so there wasn't water available. And so, but those are all things that could have happened to men and women. So they don't necessarily answer this question about what was particular about women. And the answer here is that the bathrooms for women in this particular base were located far away from the barracks, and so female soldiers had to walk at night or walk a long ways to get to the bathrooms. And what happened was that a couple of them were assaulted on the way at night, and so women, in order to avoid having to go to the bathroom, stopped drinking water early on, and so had died of dehydration because they were trying to avoid going to the bathroom because they didn't want to be sexually assaulted. And so this, I think, is a perfect example of gender mainstreaming, which I think is another avenue that has a lot of potential to unpack in the women, peace, and security agenda. And then finally, I'm sure I can share these slides with folks, I think, with whoever's interested. But during the Super Bowl last year, or 2 years ago now, I think, Gillette put on this ad, which was great. It was an ad. Normally, I think I would show it on the screen, but it was an ad about what it means to be a boy and how it's important for that definition of what it means to be a boy to be very flexible these days. And so, boys can cry, boys can play with dolls, all that kind of thing. It was all in this video. And what was shocking is if you look down here, there were 813,000 people that liked this video and 1.6 million people that disliked this video, which goes to show you that there's still very strong definitions of what masculinity means and what is appropriate for what it means to be a man. And so that's the third area where I think there's a lot of promising work to be done on women, peace, and security, which is actually on masculinity. And then finally, I didn't, this is not a slight to Australia, but I did when the attacks in New Zealand happened. A lot of people were talking about how Jacinda Ardern was handling the situation in a very feminine way. And so my colleague and I did some analysis on the words that she was using. And I think here's another area for there to be much more research, which is there really a feminist politics or a feminine way of responding to conflict? And is that actually a better way? What is the feminine leadership style? What does it look like? And there's a lot of research that can be done on this. So I think that's another path forward as well. And finally, the very, very last thing that I want to say, and this is maybe ending on a pessimistic note, is that in terms of women, peace, and security, I've highlighted 4 areas where the research can move forward. But there's a real concern about peacekeeping in general these days, and that's because of what's happening to the UN Security Council. There's been stalemates happening between the US and Russia, and more recently between the US and China, with respect to civil conflict. So lots of vetoes happening for settlements in Syria, settlements in Yemen. And so this kind of begs the question of what's the relevance of the UN Security Council if they can't come up with resolutions for ending or mediating conflicts or sending peacekeeping missions to where they're really needed. And more broadly, is this kind of a turn away from liberalism? And I know you probably have had maybe other talks about that particular topic, but it's kind of, you know, if we were to contextualize women in peacekeeping, well, that's not really possible if there are no more peacekeeping missions in the world. And so this is kind of, this is on everybody's radar at the moment. So I will end there and look forward to all of your questions and comments.